What's going on, everybody? My name is Chris. Welcome to Bourbinsane. Today we're going to be talking about what's the difference between Scotch and bourbon. So what is bourbon? In order for a whiskey to be considered a bourbon, it has to be made in the United States, has to be made up of at least 51% corn, and it has to be aged in unused charred oak barrels. And remember, a bourbon doesn't have to be made in Kentucky to be considered a bourbon. If it's a Kentucky straight bourbon, then yes, it does have to be made in Kentucky, but it can be made anywhere in the United States to be just a standard bourbon. There's several different bourbon distilleries all throughout Kentucky, in Lexington, Bardstown, Louisville, all over Kentucky in general, and throughout the country actually. Now, Scotch is made up almost completely of malted barley, not corn like bourbon is. Scotch is also aged in used bourbon barrels typically. So remember, with bourbon, it has to be aged in unused charred oak barrels, but with Scotch, they usually reuse bourbon barrels to age their product. I could go into a long history about Scotch and what it is and where it came from, but I'm just going to go over a brief overview today. So the flavors in Scotch usually different depending on where the Scotch is made in Scotland. So again, Scotch gets its name from Scotland because that's where the product is usually made and aged. So there's different regions of Scotland where the Scotch is made, and depending on the area where the whiskey comes from, it's going to taste different. So taking a look at the map here, there's several different regions of Scotland where Scotch is produced. So there's the Highlands, Speyside, the Islands, also Islay, and then the Lowlands. I always find that very interesting with Scotch, that based on the location of Scotland it comes from, you're going to pick up different flavors based on the environment, the atmosphere, where the barley is grown. It's very interesting to me. So what is single malt Scotch versus just blended Scotch? Well, it's pretty much just what it sounds. So single malt Scotch is made up of just a single malt of typically barley, what they would use to make that product. Blended Scotch is where they take several different malts and barrels and blend them together to get the taste profile they're looking for. Well, some of the main tasting notes you might find in Scotch compared to a bourbon is going to be things like rubber, wood, floral, grass. They even use something called peat, which actually adds a smoke or an ashy flavor to the whiskey. And again, this is going to be dependent on the region where the whiskey comes from in Scotland. But the Islay whiskey, so that's going to be things like Ardbeg, Laphroaig, those are going to be very peaty, very smoky flavored whiskeys. Not something I would start out with if you're just new to Scotch, but if you've been in the whiskey game for a while and want to branch out a little bit, check out some of those Islay products. Now, we've talked about all the bourbon tasting notes before, so this is going to be things like your vanillas, caramels, brown sugar, oak flavor from the barrels, and a lot of that actually comes from the char that's on the barrel when the whiskey's aged. So when they char these barrels, it imparts a lot of that burnt caramel vanilla flavor into the whiskey after it's taken out of the barrel. So a great budget blended Scotch out there is going to be Monkey Shoulder, which I actually have back here. So Monkey Shoulder is actually a product that comes from New York, but it's actually made up of 3 blends from 3 different distilleries in Scotland. So these distilleries include Balvenie, Glenfiddich, and Knivi. So the whiskey is actually aged in Scotland in those ex-bourbon barrels. And then it's sent over to the United States, where Monkey Shoulder blends the barrels together to get the taste profile they want in a small batch whiskey. Monkey Shoulder is a great blended starter Scotch. If you're just starting to branch out from bourbon into Scotch, and you want to try something easy and something that's not going to fight you, pick up a bottle of Monkey Shoulder. I think it's around $30. It's very light, very smooth, and a great introduction into the flavor profiles you're going to find with Scotch. If you're more of a Scotch guy and you're deciding to branch out into bourbon, go out and pick up a Knob Creek or maybe a Wild Turkey 101 product. Both of these are great introductions into the flavor profiles of bourbon as compared to Scotch. They're low cost too, so if you hate it, it's not a huge waste of money. Knob Creek, the 100 proof, which is the one I would recommend, is probably going to be $25 to $30. And the Wild Turkey 101 is about $26. So both are affordable products if you're just seeing if you want to get into bourbon. There are more and more micro distilleries popping up all over the place. Obviously, with something like bourbon, it takes a long time to age your products. So these distilleries are doing things like putting out gins, vodkas first because they're easy and they're quick to make. Bourbon, of course, takes time. That's why we enjoy it. I found a couple of them locally here in Michigan, and they're making some good products. The bourbon I've had was aged 8 to 12 years, I believe, so it had been aged a while at the distillery. But if you guys can find a micro distillery that is doing some cool stuff with whiskey, go out and give them a try. Thanks so much for joining me for the review today, guys. Stay insane. Thanks for watching the video today, guys. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and hit that like button and that subscribe button. Also follow me on Instagram at Bourbinsane and Facebook Bourbinsane.